Large-scale damage and losses of life are reported across the country from days of downpours. In Osong, Chungcheongbuk-do Province, more than a dozen people died at a flooded underpass. President Yoon urges an all-out response for recovery from the rain damage as he orders the declaration of a special disaster zone for some areas to free up government funds. Korea's car exports hit a fresh high in the first half of the year thanks to higher demand for eco-friendly vehicles. It's July 17, 2023. This is News Center. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. We start with the aftermath of the rain that battered the country over the weekend. We go live this evening to one of the places that was hit hard by heavy rainfall. Reporter Song Yujin is there. Yujin, what is the latest from where you are at this moment?
Well, Jung-min, I'm currently in Osong in Cheongju City in Chungcheongbuk-do Province. Our team, we've been out here since very early morning. There haven't been too many updates in the afternoon, but we're still a 2-hour drive south from the capital, Seoul. And where I'm standing right now is in front of the Gungpyeong-do underpass tunnel that was flooded on Saturday morning, which led to the loss of 13 lives and 9 more injuries. So to give you a brief overview of the situation, the underpass was completely submerged on Saturday morning after floodwater from a nearby river rushed into the tunnel. Now, before we look at the updates, let's first take a listen to what a local resident who drove past the tunnel the moment the tunnel started to submerge.
Just seconds after I drove into the underpass, my car was completely submerged. When I drove out of the tunnel, it was already beneath the floodwater.
Well, ever since then, search and rescue efforts have been ongoing with firefighters and soldiers pumping water out of the underpass so they can access it. And rescue teams were finally able to enter the tunnel late last night, a little bit after 10 p.m. And as of 2 p.m. today, they've drained out 90% of the flood water. But we still don't know exactly how many people were initially trapped inside. But rescue workers on site say they found a total of 17 vehicles, finding one more this afternoon. And all 17 as of now have been pulled out from the tunnel. And in terms of the casualties, out of the 12 people reported missing to the police, 1 person has not been found yet. So authorities are saying that there could be more people trapped inside than have been reported missing, and so the number of deaths could rise.
What about other regions, Yujin?
Well, Tommy, latest data from the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures headquarters show that as of 11 a.m. today, the death toll caused by this year's torrential rain stands at 40, with 9 people still remaining missing. Now, we want to point out that this is the highest figure of deaths and missing people reported in 12 years, but the monsoon season here in the country has yet to finish. Now, in terms of injuries, 34 more people have been injured, and more than 15,000 people have evacuated their homes from safety. And we've especially seen the southern part of the region being hardly hit by heavy rain over the weekend. So if we look at the number of deaths, 19 deaths, the most for any region, were recorded in the mountainous Gyeongsang-buk-do Province, mostly caused by landslides. Another 16 here in Chungcheongbuk-do Province, 4 in Chungcheongnam-do Province, and 1 in nearby Sejong City. And although heavy rain is not in the forecast until tonight, we're bracing for it in the coming days. That's because the Korea Meteorological Administration expects around 100 to 200 millimeters of rain to fall on Chungcheongdo, Gyeongsang-do, Jeollado provinces, and also on Jeju Island into Wednesday morning. And mountainous areas of Jeju are expected to see up to 500 millimeters. But the central region, including Seoul, Incheon City, and northern Gyeonggi-do Province, will experience slightly less rainfall, between 10 to 60 millimeters. And that's why the KMA is seeing this Thursday and Friday as the optimal, the best time to carry out recovery and rescue efforts. That's all I have for now. Back to you, Tommy.
All right, that was Song Yujin reporting live from Osong. President Yoon urged all possible resources to be mobilized for recovery from the rain damage. He ordered to declare special disaster zones for hard-hit regions to free up government funds. Our top office correspondent Kim Do-yeon reports.
As soon as he returned home from his week-long overseas trip, President Yoon Suk-yeol on Monday chaired a Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters meeting and called for regions hit especially hard by the monsoon rain to be classed as special disaster zones.
복구 작업과 재난 피해에 대한 지원 역시 신속하게 이루어져야 하고 특별 재난 지역 선포 등 정책 수단을 모두 동원하여 후속 조치를 신속하게 추진해 주기 바랍니다.
If a region is designated as a special disaster zone, the central government guarantees financial support for its recovery efforts. Yoon, meanwhile, said all possible resources have to be mobilized, including the military and the police. This is his second monsoon season since taking office, and he experienced serious rain-related incidents last year. As a president, he showed his discontent with the disaster response, saying areas exposed to such dangers were not managed well before the rainfall.
위험 지역에 대한 진입 통제와 또 위험 지역으로부터의 선제적 대피를 작년부터 거듭 강조하고 있습니다마는 현장에서 재난 대응의 기본 원칙이 지켜지지 않는다면 국민의 안전을 확보하기 어렵습니다.
As the nation is expecting more heavy rain in the next few days, Yoon called for the authorities to take on the situation with extraordinary alertness. He also added that the mindset of disaster prevention has to be completely reset as climate change has made heavy rainfall to be routine. Following the meeting, he took time to visit Yecheon of Chungcheongbuk-do Province, where a landslide took at least 9 lives, and as of Monday afternoon, around 10 are still missing. He was briefed by the county chief and took time to visit a temporary shelter for those who had their homes submerged by mud and rocks.
식사 좀 잘 하시면서 정부에서 다 복구해드리고 다 할 테니까 너무 걱정하지 마십시오. 네.
In the meantime, the spokesperson for the top office said in a written statement that during the disaster response meeting, President Yoon called for public servants working in safety to go out there and see for themselves and what should be done, especially considering that rain is expected to continue for the next few days as well. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Leaders from the country's rival political parties are visiting regions affected by the extreme monsoon downpours, delivering messages of sympathy and consolation. The ruling People Power Party leader Kim Ki-hyun headed to Chungcheongbuk-do Province to view regions flooded by the torrential rain. Previously on Sunday, the main opposition Democratic Party of Korea leader Lee Jae-myung visited Chungcheongbuk-do Province, where more than 1,000 residents have been evacuated. The rival parties both called for quick recovery efforts and support for the victims, as well as measures to prevent future weather-related disasters. Meanwhile, many National Assembly standing committees had their scheduled meetings either postponed or canceled. The South Korean president is now back home, having wrapped up his trip to Europe. That included a surprise stopover in Ukraine, aligning with like-minded partners. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji explains more on what this trip means.
After wrapping up his 8-day-long trip to Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, President Yoon arrived in Seoul at about 5:30 a.m. on Friday morning. During his visit to Ukraine over the weekend, the president promised that South Korea will provide more non-lethal military supplies and over $200 million of humanitarian assistance and financial aid to rebuild the war-torn country. Traveling a total of 27 hours by road and rail to reach Ukraine from Poland, Yoon became the first South Korean leader to visit a nation at war.
대한민국은 우크라이나의 자유와 평화, 번영을 가꾸는 동반자가 될 것이며 나아가 우크라이나와 함께 세계의 자유, 평화, 번영에 함께 기여하는 믿음직한 파트너가 될 것입니다. 그 희망찬 미래를 향해 저와 젤렌스키 대통령은 더욱 긴밀히 소통하고 협력해 나아갈 것입니다.
While holding talks with the Ukrainian leader, Yoon pledged to expand supplies of critical equipment for Ukrainian forces and support recovery and counseling for children traumatized and violated by the ongoing war.
Specifically, we can happily conclude that an agreement on the transfer of specialized vehicles and technical equipment, including for demining, is already being implemented. This helps us preserve human lives. Thank you, Mr. President, for new initiatives on financial, technical, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine.
President Yoon declared a new aid package to expand Seoul's military, humanitarian, and reconstruction assistance. In terms of humanitarian aid, Seoul plans to increase its annual contribution this year by 30% on year to $150 million. Yoon also noted that around $100 million has been allocated for long-term low-interest loans in a bilateral MOU to fund Ukraine's various reconstruction projects. Meanwhile, pundits say the surprise visit to Ukraine could be part of South Korea's efforts to strengthen security cooperation with the U.S. and Japan ahead of their trilateral summit that could possibly take place next month in Washington.
By strengthening trilateral ties between South Korea, U.S. and Japan, the Yoon administration's diplomacy has been focused on playing its role as a global pivotal state within the international community. While doing that, it has also been strengthening cooperation with NATO.
Leaders of all three countries have now visited Ukraine. Before stopping by Kyiv, President Yoon visited Lithuania, where he attended the meeting of NATO country leaders that was extended to invited nations. Addressing world leaders, he called for stronger condemnation and response to North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. Then in Poland, Yoon held a summit with his Polish counterpart, Andrzej Duda, and established a three-way system with Ukraine to support its post-war reconstruction efforts. 배은지, Arirang News.
A key Crimean bridge linking the annexed peninsula to Russia was reportedly hit by two strikes early Monday, and two people have been reported dead in the incident. Russia points fingers at Ukraine, which is yet to be confirmed. Our Chung Eun-ju has the latest.
The Crimean Bridge, a key supply line for Russian troops in Ukraine between the annexed Crimean Peninsula and Russia, was damaged in an emergency situation early Monday. A Russian regional governor said two people were killed and their daughter was seriously injured due to the blasts. Russia's Gray Zone channel, a Telegram channel affiliated with the Wagner mercenary group, reported there were two strikes on the bridge at 3:04 a.m. and 3:20 a.m. Sergei Aksionov, the Russia-appointed head of Crimea, said the emergency occurred on the 145th pillar of the bridge. Russia's transport ministry said Monday that the bridge was being inspected by officials. Russian state-run news agencies reported that rail traffic on the bridge was not disrupted and is continuing to operate, although with some delays. In recent weeks, traffic jams to the entrance of the bridge went for kilometers on a daily basis as Russians went on holiday to Crimea. A Moscow-appointed official in occupied Crimea blamed Ukraine for an attack on the bridge, while Russia's state media said on Monday that unmanned drones were used for the strikes. Kyiv has not claimed any direct responsibility. Ukraine has long stated its goal of recapturing Crimea, but rarely comments directly on actions in the peninsula. Russia blamed Ukraine for an attack on the bridge last October, to which Ukraine admitted only indirectly to the attack months later. The nearly 12-mile structure, also known as the Kerch Bridge, is the longest in Europe and carries both road and rail traffic. A spokesperson for Ukraine's defense intelligence said Monday the destruction of part of the Crimean Bridge could create logistical difficulties for Russian forces. George Barras, an analyst at the Washington-based Institute for the Study of War, also said on Twitter that if the bridge was seriously damaged, it would significantly impact Russian supply lines. Monday is also the day on which a crucial deal that allows Ukraine to safely export grain expires. The Kremlin has voiced displeasure with the pact. Chung Eun-ju, Arirang News.
Findings for the first half of this year show global demand for eco-friendly cars made in Korea has led to a record high in the country's auto exports. Our Moon Hae-ryun tells us more.
South Korea's auto industry recorded an exports boom for the first half of the year, hitting an all-time high on the back of the rising popularity of eco-friendly vehicles. Data from the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy on Monday showed that the total value of auto exports amounted to $35.7 billion for the January to June period this year. This is the highest related figure ever recorded, beating the previous record of $25.2 billion set in 2014. And combined with the value of outbound auto parts, the total surpassed $47 billion. Meaning that the country is well on track to meet its $80 billion goal for the end of this year. The ministry attributed this to the rising popularity of so-called eco-friendly vehicles such as electric and hybrid cars, which saw more than a 70% rise in total export value compared to the same period last year. 385,000 of these cars were sold, meaning that around a quarter of all outbound cars were in the eco-friendly category. June alone saw the second highest export value of green cars in history and marked the fifth consecutive month in which sales exceeded the $2 billion mark. The popularity of electric vehicles was seen most prominently in the United States and in Europe, with Hyundai Motors' Ioniq 5 and 6 electric vehicles selling out at record rates. Last week, the firm reported that sales in the UK had reached the highest level since 2018. Car production was also restored to 2019's pre-COVID-19 capacity, along with a supply of chips and various parts. More than 2 million units were produced during the first half of the year. Meanwhile, auto sales within South Korea were up by around 10% compared to the same period last year. 894,000 cars were sold, with the vast majority of those being domestically produced cars. South Korea has seen a rising preference for cars from domestic firms over foreign imports, with domestic car sales rising by over 8% on year, while foreign car sales fell by over 3%. Eco-friendly cars accounted for just under a third of total sales, and hybrid cars were the most popular, selling over 177,000 units and making up nearly 67% of total eco-friendly car sales. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
Household debt in South Korea is rising at an alarming level. In fact, the central bank says it's the third highest among major economies. Our economic correspondent Shin Ha-seong explains what should be done to lower the financial stability risk.
As of last year, the household debt-to-GDP ratio in South Korea was 105%. Among 43 major economies, this was the third largest after Switzerland and Australia, the Bank of Korea said on Monday. The BOK pointed out that the high profitability and stability of household loans, as well as insufficient regulations on them, as the causes of the increase in such debt. Financial institutions have been providing a relatively large amount in these loans compared to corporate ones, as they have lower default rates and higher profitability. According to the BOK, the impact of the increased household debt on financial stability has been limited due to the large proportion of high net income borrowers. But there are rising concerns that over the longer term, it could hinder economic growth and widen asset inequality.
The financial sector can become very weak because if the economy slows down and many of these families can no longer pay back the debt, then some financial institutions may become insolvent.
To reduce household debt, the bank said it was necessary to use macroeconomics and monetary policies that are especially focused on financial stability. It also suggested revising current loan regulations, such as minimizing exceptions to the debt service ratio or DSR.
DSR was effective in limiting the growth of household debt. It wasn't completely successful in reducing household debt, but combination of increasing interest rates and DSR ratio probably did much to keep household debt growth in check. Now, if the government loosens up the DSR regulations and households take more loans, then there is a possibility that households will take much more loans than they can afford.
According to data from the Bank of International Settlements, Seoul's DSR was 13.6% last year. This is the second highest among 17 major economies after Australia, indicating a greater debt repayment burden compared to income. 신하영, Arirang News.
China's economy grew slower than expected in its second quarter amid fading post-COVID recovery momentum. Data from China's National Bureau of Statistics revealed Monday that the country's economy grew 6.3% from April to June compared to a year earlier. This fell below the market expectations of a group of economists polled by Reuters of 7.3%. Market watchers say the recorded growth, which is because of the low base effect, is losing steam, with retail sales rising by a little over 3% in June, the slowest growth since last December. Also, another sign of the nation's faltering recovery was youth unemployment, once again hitting an all-time high of 21.3% in June, up from 20.8% in May. It's time now to take a look at what's been happening in the world of sports. Joining us in the studio is our sports editor, Paul Need. Hello, Paul.
Hello there.
So let's first start with baseball. Kim Ha-seong with another home run. What can you tell us?
Yes, another one, and it was his second MLB leadoff home run as well. For the San Diego Padres on Sunday, Kim Ha-seong hit a leadoff home run against the Philadelphia Phillies and their starting pitcher, Zach Wheeler. It came at the top of the first inning to give the Padres a 1-0 lead. The Padres lost the game 7-6, but the home run gives Kim a total of 11 scored this season, which brings him level with his total from last season, which was a career best. He also has 33 RBIs from 89 games played. Meanwhile, it was announced on Thursday that the Padres, along with the LA Dodgers, will begin the 2024 MLB season in Seoul on March 20th and 21st as part of the Seoul series. No venue announced yet on that one, but in other news, Yoo Hyun-jin on Saturday pitched 5 innings in a minor league game. He gave up just 1 run on 3 hits in those 5 innings as he stepped up his recovery from elbow surgery from June 2022.
Right. In golf, a couple of Korean stars finished in the top 10 over the weekend. It was a tune-up for a major tournament.
Yes, that's right. And An Byung-hun and Kim Joo-hyung were the ones who performed particularly well from the South Korean contingent at the Genesis Scottish Open in North Berwick, Scotland on Sunday, and finished tied for 3rd at 10 under 270, 5 strokes back of the winner Rory McIlroy. Kim, meanwhile, finished tied for 6th at 9 under par. The Scottish Open is co-sanctioned by the PGA and the DP World Tour as a precursor to the Open Championship, which is the 4th and final major of the season. That takes place at Royal Liverpool Golf Club in England from July 20th to the 23rd. An Byung-hun has qualified following his top 3 finish in Scotland, while Kim Ji-hyung had already qualified.
Moving on to tennis. Wimbledon concluded over the weekend.
It did indeed, and Spain's Carlos Alcaraz has won his 2nd ever Grand Slam title and his first Wimbledon men's singles title. The 20-year-old upset world #1 Novak Djokovic, who was aiming to clinch his 5th straight title. Sunday's final was a 5-set epic, with Alcaraz looking like he had a mountain to climb after conceding the first set 1-6. But he managed to level and then overtake his Serbian opponent before Djokovic levelled by winning the 4th set. Down to the deciding 5th, Alcaraz beat the defending champion 6 games to 4. Meanwhile, the Czech Republic's Markéta Vondrousova won the women's title on Saturday in 2 straight sets, becoming the first unseeded woman to win the Wimbledon crown.
And finally, South Korea's men's football squad for the Asian Games were announced. Any surprises?
Yes, there was 1 or 2 surprises. The 3 wildcards, meaning those aged over 24, are Park Jin-sop and Paek Sung-ho of Jeonbuk and Ulsan's Sol Young-woo. Lee Gang-in has been selected, although it is still unclear whether his new team, Paris Saint-Germain, will release him for the tournament. This is because the ASIAD men's tournament isn't part of the FIFA international calendar, and so clubs aren't obligated to release their players. But for Korea's male athletes at the Asian Games, there's more than just medals at stake, as gold would mean military exemption. Having to undertake military service could disrupt a player's career, particularly if they are playing abroad. As well as Lee Gang-in, there are 4 Euro-based players who have been named in the squad: Jung Eui-young, Hong Hyun-sok and Park Gyu-hyun. The Asian Games get underway on September the 23rd in Hangzhou, China.
Thanks for that, Paul. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. See you.
Monsoonal rain has been battering the south of the country over the weekend. Heavy rain alerts are still in place for Jeollado and Gyeongsang-do provinces. Expect nationwide showers to continue for tomorrow as well. Heavy rain will be concentrated across the south once again. As for the overall amount of rainfall, mountainous regions of Jeju Island will see severe downpours of up to 500 millimeters. The south coast will see up to 400. The south of the country and Chungcheongbuk-do Province will see up to 300 millimeters. Periods of locally heavy downpours will vary depending on the region. Until tomorrow morning, Gyeonggi-do and Gangwon-do provinces will see 30 to 60 millimeters per hour. For Jeju Island, 30 to 80 millimeters per hour are expected for the entire day. Please continue to monitor the potential for localized flooding across low-lying areas. Under rainy spells, Seoul and Daejeon will be starting off at 23 degrees Celsius. Highs in Seoul get up to 29, Gwangju 28, Daegu and Gyeongju will be topping out at 27 degrees. Between Wednesday and Thursday, sunny skies will make a return. It's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is News Center for tonight. Thanks for watching. A panel session coming up.
I'm live. 저를 도와주시는 분들이
저희와 함께 해주시는 세션분들
아무리 봐도 없지. 펜션 같은데 아니라고 아무도 안 하는 거고.
좋아요.
한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
stories on site. From Korea to the world, and from the world to Korea. We ask questions every day that could change the world. Taking news a step further, Arirang News. You're watching Arirang News. You're watching Arirang.
한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 웰컴. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 웰컴. (24시간) 불이 꺼지지 않는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. President Yoon Suk-yeol has ended his week-long visit to Europe. The highlight was his unexpected visit to Ukraine, where he promised more non-lethal military supplies and over $200 million of humanitarian assistance and financial aid. Another scene to look at in the diplomatic arena last week was the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. There, Foreign Minister Park Jin met Chinese top diplomat Wang Yi and rallied support against North Korea that fired a long-range ballistic missile just before the meetings took place. Now for this, we invite Dr. Pan Gil-ju, Senior Research Fellow from the Institute of International and Area Studies, Seogang University. Dr. Pan, welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening. And we also have Professor Mason Ritchie from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor Ritchie, thank you for your time.
Great, thanks for having me.
All right, thank you. Now, Professor Ritchie, first question to you. So President Yoon made a surprise visit to Ukraine on Saturday, and he visited the site of mass killings in Bucha and Irpin, where a civilian residential area had been subject to large-scale missile attacks. What does this show?
Yeah, so I think in the first place, this really reflects the Yoon administration's rhetorical focus on universal values. He's talked quite a bit about freedom and prosperity as one of the pillars, not only of his domestic policy, but also foreign policy. And of course, ultimately, the foundation for people living in freedom and people having the chance to build lives of prosperity is that we respect, both domestically and internationally, human rights. So I think that that's clearly part of it. And this reflects the larger emphasis that the Yoon administration has on becoming what it refers to as a global pivotal state, which is to say a state that isn't simply concerned about its role in the Korean Peninsula or in the Northeast Asia region, or even in East Asia more generally, but in fact global, and so reflecting global universal values. One has to think that domestic politics also plays a role. I mean, it certainly isn't going to hurt the Yoon administration domestically to be shown as being, quote unquote, on the right side of history and supporting, human rights in a country under attack like Ukraine. And then lastly, Yoon wants to be seen as an important leader, like those in the United States or France or other countries, Japan, France, or Germany. Whose leaders have gone to Ukraine as well. And so I think in some sense, this is a sort of pilgrimage for leaders who want to be seen as globally important today.
Right, I see. So this visit was apparently a step to become a global pivotal state. Now, Dr. Ban, President Yoon's such surprise visit to Ukraine was actually made upon Ukrainian President Zelensky's invitation. He apparently sent a letter through the country's First Lady, Olena Zelenska. Now, what role is Ukraine expecting South Korea to play?
Well, first of all, South Korea has focused heavily on humanitarian and non-lethal weapons-based support so far, and it seems to continue a basic policy of not providing military weapons. Meanwhile, I think Ukraine expected South Korea to make more comprehensive support, and South Korea responded to it and promised to play an enhanced role in making peace more visible and widespread. It seems clear that South Korea evolved its policy to a more comprehensive one while diversifying the scope of support for Ukraine. In particular, this summit served as an arena to make South Korea develop policy for rebuilding Ukraine in full swing. In addition, South Korea promised to expand the aid of non-lethal weapons. Military assets might be more urgent from a viewpoint of Ukraine in a situation where it is still at war, because the rebuilding project that South Korea proposes to Ukraine is not able to begin until the end of the war. In this vein, it is true that Ukraine needs more lethal weapons, but it appears to instead ask for more comprehensive one to Korea. Although the aid of lethal weapons is not on the table, I don't think this option is completely closed, because security aid, one of the three aids, could have the greater potential. Moreover, South Korea earlier mentioned that it will watch how changing the battlefield situations are to figure out whether it is more supportive of Ukraine than now. As of right now, South Korea has decided to keep a rule of not supporting lethal weapons. One thing is clear though: how to support Ukraine is a matter of Korea's sovereignty, which should not be intervened by external actors.
Right, I see. Since our Dr. Ban tapped on this comprehensive package, I'd like to delve a little bit deeper on this. So the two sides agreed on this package covering security, humanitarian, and reconstruction assistance from South Korea to Ukraine with the so-called Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. Now, Dr. Ban, what are the details, and especially what does it mean for South Korea to be part of this so-called the Second Marshall Plan?
Yeah, of course. Comprehensive package looks noteworthy, which is laid out, as you mentioned earlier, under the name of the Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. Why does it look comprehensive? I would say that it is comprehensive indeed because it covers all three key assets, including security aid, humanitarian aid, and support for Ukraine's reconstruction. To be more precise, when it comes to security assistance, two sides agreed to host the Summit for Peace Formula, and South Korea promised to increase its humanitarian support to Ukraine. In addition to $100 million assistance provided last year and the $150 million assistance for this year, South Korea announced to plan new humanitarian assistance while cooperating with World Bank. What matters more is the third area, which is to enhance cooperation between enterprises of the two sides for rebuilding Ukraine. In particular, this summit clarified how South Korea helps rebuild and reconstruct Ukraine. We need to take a look at what South Korea's role in rebuilding Ukraine means in general. The Yoon government has stressed contribution diplomacy since it launched last year. This policy is aimed at making South Korea, which has become a free and developed country thanks to international society, pay back, particularly countries in need. So Ukraine serves as the most optical case for contribution diplomacy. The joint statement notifies this point clearly. If then, how can South Korea help rebuild Ukraine? Actually, South Korea has successfully experienced the rebuilding project earlier overseas. The Jaitun division of South Korea helped rebuild the villages at Arbil in Iraq from 2004 to 2008. Back then, this team provided medical assistance to residents, provided vocational training to them, and built a social and economic infrastructure. This project turned out a great success, as residents at Arbil called the Jaitun division a gift from God. Rebuilding Ukraine could seem different from rebuilding Iraq because the former is expected to be led by civilian companies, but experience itself could be useful for making things done. South Korea is well placed to do this role because it is not only experienced this project, but also has a willingness and capability, particularly under this administration. I think a social and cultural network building, as well as a massive project of building infrastructure, is expected to be made in this process for Ukraine.
I see. It is interesting to hear that this Ukraine is optimal case to show the contribution diplomacy of South Korea. Now, Professor Ritchie, though Dr. Bond pointed out that providing lethal aid is not completely a closed option, for now, Seoul has maintained its position of providing only non-lethal aid to Ukraine. What do you believe was the reason behind South Korea's such decision?
Yeah, so there may be domestic legal hurdles in South Korea to providing this type of lethal aid, but ultimately those are not impossible to overcome, which makes me really think that this is a foreign and security policy decision taken by the Yoon administration, reflecting caution with respect to Russia as a potentially dangerous international actor. A cornered animal, if you will. Moscow can't really help, for instance, with North Korea, which is one of South Korea's, if not South Korea's largest security concern. But Moscow can certainly make North Korea worse for South Korea. And so I think that there's always in the back of any administration's mind on the South Korean peninsula, in South Korea, that the external actors such as Russia can enable North Korea to engage in more mischief and become more dangerous vis-a-vis South Korea. So I think that's one concern. I think in the background we also have China a little bit. As we know, Russia and China are in what they refer to as a no-limits strategic partnership. Now, I think that there are certainly limits there. There doesn't seem to be any doubt about that. But Moscow and Beijing are relatively closely aligned, and to the extent that South Korea assists in repelling this Russian invasion of Ukraine with lethal aid, the Yoon administration may fear that this could make relations with China more difficult. Of course, there are also some economic interests as well vis-a-vis Russia. They're relatively minor, but there's something that's worth keeping in mind. And then, of course, finally, I think the Yoon administration may think that providing lethal aid directly to Ukraine might cause there to be some domestic political costs for the Yoon administration if the South Korean population feels that that might be something that's too risky to engage in.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Ritchie, let's move on to ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting that recently took place. Foreign Minister Park Jin held a one-on-one meeting with Chinese top diplomat Wang Yi, and they reportedly agreed to strengthen bilateral communications and exchanges at various levels. What significance does this have in terms of bilateral relations?
Yeah, so South Korea has ever since Yoon came into office, moved more closely into the orbit of the United States. South Korea has, of course, become much closer with Japan than was the case underneath the predecessor Moon administration. And of course, this makes China nervous. And so, as South Korea has moved more into an orbit that is seen by Beijing as being contrary to Chinese interests, this type of meeting at the ASEAN Regional Forum provides us a chance for the South Korean government to put a sort of floor underneath relations with China. And to signal to China that the relationship between Seoul and Beijing is still important, which of course it is. China remains South Korea's #1 trading partner. Their economies are tightly linked. Regional security is an important consideration for South Korea, especially to the extent that China and North Korea are closely aligned with each other, and therefore, China can make things, either much better or much worse with respect to North Korea and how much of a threat it represents for South Korea. And of course, there are geopolitical considerations, whether that be Taiwan or the South China Sea or other areas. So I think that's one set of reasons. The other, I think, really is to some degree the Yoon administration is simply following in the footsteps of other states that are trying to put a floor underneath relations with Beijing. And this is especially important in the case of South Korea, where there's been a number of recent diplomatic spats between Beijing and Seoul.
Right, I see your point. Now, Dr. Ban, after the talk, through local media outlets, it is said that Wang Yi reportedly underlined the fact that China and South Korea are close neighbors and inseparable partners, like our Professor Ricci said, and said a third party should have no influence over such a relationship. Now, does this suggest China's hopes to improve the relationship between the two countries in the near future?
To start with, I think South Korea as well as China show their willingness to make the relationship improve through 45 minutes talks. Meanwhile, we need to examine what Director Wang Yi meant by the exclusion of the third party, because it shows China's consistent posture despite this enhanced willingness to improve the relations. Director Wang seems to stress that the U.S. serves as an obstacle to improving the relations between Republic of Korea and China. To put it another way, China appears to be concerned about the bust a cohesive and strong alliance ever between South Korea and the United States. Beijing believes this strong solidarity serves as a source to hinder the South Korea-China relationship from improving. This recognition shows how the new Cold War is playing in international politics, and China wants to seize the initiative of the new Cold War. In more detail, China seems to feel unpleased with current South Korean administration change of policy on diplomacy and security. The Yoon administration is different from the prior administration in terms of strategic philosophy, the scope of diplomacy, and finally, how to gain security. The current government follows strategic clarity against strategic ambiguity carried out by the predecessor. Second, the former government sought balanced diplomacy, whereas the Yoon government seeks global pure state-oriented diplomacy. Finally, how to gain security is different. The former administration emphasized the peace process, whereas the current administration pays attention to peace through strength. This changing posture has led to making South Korea more recognized in the world and increasing diplomatic leverage to China. I believe China wants to offset this situation, but with a softer posture than before. All in all, both South Korea and China are well aware that each needs the other because of their geopolitical connectivity. In particular, South Korea is more than willing to preside at the ROC-Japan-China summit this year as a stepping stone to making the relationship between Seoul and Beijing more cooperative.
Right, so two countries both acknowledge the necessity of each other. Interesting. Now, Dr. Ban, why don't we move on to the North Korean issues as well? Now, many were eyeing the possibility of North Korean Foreign Minister Choi Sun-il's participation in the ARF, but she did not come. Could we say that North Korea is not yet ready to come out to the negotiating table? How did you see this?
North Korea seems to think that a policy of strong versus strong is better than raising its voice in a diplomatic arena, in the sense that the Kim regime fired Ha-seong 18 ICBM as the ARF was occurring. If the Kim regime had considered that it would be right about time to focus more on diplomacy or come out to the negotiating table, it must have chosen a different time to launch ICBM. So North Korea seems to believe it is time for the military, not diplomacy now. Meanwhile, there are countries that North Korea focuses on for better diplomacy and solidarity, which are obviously China and Russia. Why? They are always on the side of North Korea as permanent members of the UN Security Council. In short, North Korea takes advantage of the new corridor mechanism to step up its nuclear program. So, all in all, North Korea remains provocative militarily and stays away from diplomacy, primarily thanks to its solidarity with China and Russia. It remains to be seen how sustainable this mechanism will be, though.
Right, I see your point. Now, Professor Richie, I believe this will be our last question, but we cannot leave out the relationship between South Korea and the ASEAN, right? So, Foreign Minister Park Jin said that Seoul is planning to deepen partnership with ASEAN through the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative. What is this initiative and what importance does ASEAN have, not just in terms of dealing with North Korea, but also in pushing Indo-Pacific strategy? Could you briefly tell us?
Yeah, so the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative really helps align South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is sort of what ASEAN calls its Indo-Pacific strategy. And this is important because South Korea does want to diversify its relations away from too much of a preponderance on the United States and China. So part of the idea of a global pivotal state that we talked about is that South Korea is supposed to have a more proactive role in places outside of its comfort zone and outside of areas of close geographic proximity. And so that includes Europe, but it also includes obviously the ASEAN area as well. South Korea does have quite a bit of interest in this. In the first place, obviously economically, where South Korea has tremendous investments through companies, but also geopolitically in places such as Vietnam and Philippines and a number of important ASEAN countries. And in the second place, North Korea, historically, has created quite a bit of mischief in the region through transshipments of various sanctioned goods and products, possibly through using this area as a place for some of its cyber activities, which bring hard currency into the country. So North Korea is somewhere in the background of this as well. And so this, Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative is going to focus on, core areas of trying to build the strategic partnership between Korea and ASEAN, such as the environment, capacity building, digital connectivity, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, cyber cooperation, and those areas.
All right, I see many areas to cooperate. All right, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Dr. Ban, and thank you, Professor Richie, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.
What can I say? This place is amazing.